US President Donald Trump has implored Ukraine to accept a Russian proposal for direct talks rather than insist on a ceasefire first. The leaders of France, Germany, the UK, and Poland had visited Kiev and set a deadline of Monday for Russia to accept a 30-day ceasefire. Otherwise, they warned that Russia will face additional sanctions. When President Vladimir Putin of Russia made a counteroffer of direct talks without mentioning a ceasefire, France and Germany both rebuffed the proposal. In fact, President Trump's envoy to Ukraine, who was also part of the talks, General Keith Kellogg, had said earlier that Russia should halt the hostilities as a first step in the negotiations. But Trump wrote in a post on Truth Social that President Putin of Russia does not want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine. The Russian leader, according to Trump, wanted direct talks to be hosted by Turkey later this week in Istanbul. Ukraine should agree to this immediately, Trump wrote on his social media post. Zelensky responded pretty cautiously to the Russian counteroffer for direct talks. He once again insisted there has to be a halt in the fighting before there can be any talks. But after Trump's post, Zelensky added a new twist to the ongoing diplomatic brinkmanship. Zelensky said he would personally be attending the negotiations in Istanbul. Putin, when he proposed those direct talks, did not intend for a presidential meeting, did not intend for a meeting between himself and Zelensky. He just said direct talks, but at a junior level. Zelensky's declaration in a post on X did not clarify whether his participation would depend on Russia first accepting a ceasefire. But he once again called on Russia to halt the hostilities to allow for diplomacy. The flurry of exchanges came hours after Putin effectively rejected the Monday ceasefire deadline, and instead he proposed that direct talks between representatives of the two countries take place this week in Istanbul. Before setting the Monday deadline and threatening additional sanctions, European leaders had spoken with President Trump on the phone from Kiev on Saturday. They said that the United States would also impose sanctions on Russia if Putin did not agree to a truce. But Trump started singing an altogether different tune. In February 2025, US and Russian delegates met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to try and discuss improving relations and also to put forth plans to end the war in Ukraine. Notably, in that meeting, no Ukrainian or European delegations were invited to that summit. Additionally, there was a further follow-up meeting in March where American and Ukrainian representatives met in Jeddah, again in Saudi Arabia, to discuss these peace negotiations. America had to restore aid and also intelligence sharing, both of which it had previously cut off to Ukraine after that stormy meeting at the Oval Office between President Trump, President Zelensky, and Vice President J.D. Vance. Since initiating the efforts to end the war in Ukraine 3 months ago, the Trump administration has aligned more closely with Russia. It has voted with Russia in a United Nations vote. It has also resumed broader diplomatic ties with Moscow. It has left in place existing economic sanctions, but not ramped up pressure with additional sanctions, even as Vladimir Putin has shown very little signs of pulling back in the war. In fact, President Putin has expressed no agreement with a US proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. He says the terms still need to be worked out. He's been dithering on this 30-day ceasefire proposal. Putin instead says that any cessation of hostilities should lead to a lasting peace, and that can happen only if they address the root cause of the conflict. Putin has also expressed concerns that Ukraine might use this ceasefire period of 30 days to try and rearm, and that is exactly what he wants to avoid. But the Trump administration has something else that it needs to contend with. Civilian casualties have risen quite alarmingly since the Trump administration first began ceasefire talks a couple of months ago. If you were to look at the civilian casualties between then and now compared to the same period a year ago, and this is data from the United Nations, there is a substantial increase in the number of civilian casualties, and that is something Trump is concerned about. Ukraine back in March had agreed to an American proposal for an unconditional ceasefire. Russia, though, is still holding out. In addition to Putin's call for direct talks, the spokesman from the Kremlin also said that Russia will only accept a truce if Western governments stop supplying arms to Ukraine. None of the Western governments have agreed to that just yet. President Trump has taken a generally conciliatory stand towards Russia. He's offered major concessions to Russia, including barring Ukraine from NATO forever, recognizing whatever territorial gains Russia has made in the Donbass, which is in the east of Ukraine. However, Putin has not budged. He has shown no willingness to compromise, and that has led to a degree of frustration from the Trump administration. Despite this, Putin maintains a level of engagement with Trump, possibly to keep diplomatic channels open and also to leverage the situation as he feels to Russia's advantage. But the Europeans are seeing through Putin's game. President Emmanuel Macron of France called Russia's response insufficient. Even as he was just leaving Ukraine, he said it was a first step, but it was not good enough. Macron also said that Putin was stalling with his counteroffer of direct talks, and he simply wants to buy time. It's a sentiment shared by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who supported Zelensky's demand that Russia first has to agree to a 30-day ceasefire before there can be direct talks. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey spoke with President Putin. He told him he was willing to host the discussions between Russia and Ukraine. Erdogan also said that a comprehensive ceasefire could lead to a lasting deal which will put an end to the war. But who will end up going to Istanbul is still up in the air. The Kremlin declared a unilateral 3-day truce last week around the country's celebration of Victory Day, which is the anniversary of the Allied forces' victory over Nazi Germany. Ukraine's military did confirm that most long-range strikes in that period had halted, but fighting along the front lines continued without a pause. Russia resumed its long-range drone attacks on Ukraine overnight starting Sunday after the 3-day ceasefire expired.